The First World War ended with guns falling silent, but for Germany, the peace felt like a sentence, not a reprieve. The Kaiser abdicated, the empire dissolved, and a fragile republic inherited defeat, debt, and rage. Cities struggled with shortages, veterans returned to queues and ration cards instead of jobs. Versailles stripped territory, colonies, and pride, and then demanded reparations large enough to drown any hope of recovery. On street corners and in beer halls, a bitter story took root. Germany had not been beaten in the field, people said, but stabbed in the back by politicians, profiteers, and enemies within. It was a lie, yet a useful one. It simplified catastrophe into betrayal, turned confusion into certainty, and offered targets for anger that no policy debate could match. Meanwhile, the Weimar coalition attempted the impossible, stabilizing currency, negotiating terms, and writing a democratic constitution while extremists on both flanks denounced compromise as treason. Newspapers filled with recriminations, paramilitaries drilled after dark. The Republic's birth certificate was printed in the ink of defeat, and that stain would not wash out. In 1919, most Germans wanted normal life to return, but normal required trust, and trust was scarce. What grew instead were movements promising purpose, unity, and answers that fit on a banner. The soil was ready. All it lacked was a voice that could turn humiliation into a marching rhythm, and persuade a wounded nation that the quickest path out of shame ran straight through obedience. Munich, 1919. Beer halls thick with smoke, thick with frustration. Ex-soldiers, shopkeepers, clerks, people who felt the ground had shifted under their feet, argued about who was to blame and what to do. Among them spoke a former lance corporal whose power was not in rank or resume, but in breath. Adolf Hitler discovered that when he spoke, rooms quieted, then crackled. He joined a tiny nationalist club, the German Workers' Party, that handed out leaflets and passed the hat. He gave it a new name, a new symbol, and something more valuable than both: momentum. The National Socialist German Workers' Party fused resentment with ritual, flags and salutes, uniforms and songs, the theater of belonging. Its message was brutally simple. Versailles was a crime, Weimar a fraud, and Germany a victim destined for rebirth. Conspiracy explained everything. Enemies simplified politics. Crowds swelled because the party offered what the Republic couldn't. The feeling that chaos would end and certainty return. Organization followed emotion. Local cells, speaking tours, a newspaper that repeated slogans until they felt like truth. The SA, a paramilitary in brown shirts, gave the movement street muscle and a sense of inevitability. The party didn't yet command the nation, but it learned to command attention, an equally potent currency in a democracy fraying at the edges. By 1922, it had a stage, an audience, and a script that promised order to the disoriented and dignity to the humiliated. A politician was being manufactured in public, and the raw material was grievance. Hyperinflation turned wages into waste paper and savings into punchlines. In 1923, with the Ruhr occupied and the mark collapsing by the hour, Munich felt combustible. Hitler studied Mussolini's march on Rome and drew the wrong lesson: that a bold gesture could substitute for power. On November 8th, his followers burst into a beer hall where Bavarian leaders were meeting. He clambered onto a table and declared a national revolution. Outside, the SA tried to seize key buildings. By morning, the illusion was over. Police fired, 16 Nazis died. Hitler fell, dislocated his shoulder, and was arrested while hiding at a friend's house. It should have ended him. Instead, the trial became his audition for a national audience. He wrapped sedition in patriotism and presented himself not as a criminal, but a prophet. Judges indulged him. Newspapers printed every flourish. The sentence, 5 years, was largely symbolic. He served about 9 months. In prison, he dictated Mein Kampf, a manifesto stitching together expansion, racial ideology, anti-Semitism, and revenge into a single story of destiny. Few policymakers read it seriously. Many citizens ignored it. They would later learn that neglected words can become marching orders. The Putsch failed, but it taught Hitler something crucial. Power would not be taken by storm. It would be taken by strategy, through ballots, deals, and the careful conversion of crisis into law. Released from prison, Hitler surveyed a party in fragments and a country briefly stabilizing under the Dawes Plan. He adjusted. Street violence had brought headlines but not authority. Now he preached legality, not out of respect for the law, but because it was the safest road to power. The party was rebuilt like a corporation. Regional leaders, membership dues, propaganda budgets, and a discipline that turned rallies into choreography. Joseph Goebbels emerged as the movement's master of image, transforming anger into spectacle and grievance into narrative that could fit on a poster and echo through a loudspeaker. Mein Kampf became more than a book. It was a syllabus for indoctrination. Study circles discussed it. Youth groups absorbed it as catechism. Meanwhile, Hitler cultivated businessmen wary of socialism, veterans wary of chaos, and conservatives wary of Weimar's weakness. He promised order to all, while telling each audience what it most needed to hear. The Republic's apparent recovery lulled many into complacency, but the party treated the calm as rehearsal. Electoral campaigns honed logistics. Paramilitaries honed intimidation. Lawyers studied loopholes. The lesson of 1923 was internalized. The state would be captured not by breaking it, but by entering it, and then altering its rules so that departure would be impossible. The strategy was patience weaponized. In October 1929, Wall Street imploded, and with it, the fragile architecture propping up Germany's recovery. American loans vanished, factories dimmed, unemployment lines stretched past the horizon. The Great Depression didn't invent extremism, but it made it feel practical. Desperate people calculated differently. The Nazis offered answers that were simple, visible, and loud. Their rallies radiated discipline. Their posters promised bread and work. Their rhetoric blamed enemies you could picture. In the 1930 election, the party vaulted from the margins to the second-largest bloc in the Reichstag. The communists surged too, turning parliament into a chamber of vetoes and shouting. Centrist coalitions splintered. Presidential decrees replaced legislation. The republic governed by workaround. On the streets, SA marches collided with communist militias. In homes, radio carried slogans that felt more convincing than statistics. Hitler campaigned like a modern marketer. Airplanes hopscotched him across the country. Local candidates tailored messages to local fears. Grievances were segmented and targeted. He sounded less like a fanatic and more like a solution. To the fearful, that mattered more than the content of his program. Elections that should have strengthened democracy instead exposed its exhaustion. The ballot box became a stage on which faith in the system publicly eroded. By 1932, Germany had no stable majority and too much chaos. Hitler ran for president, lost to Paul von Hindenburg, but proved his capacity to mobilize millions. Behind the scenes, conservative elites, industrialists, agrarian leaders, and party bosses decided they could harness the movement's energy while restraining its leader. Franz von Papen and Kurt von Schleicher, rivals masquerading as strategists, promoted schemes that would put Hitler in office but keep him in a cage of responsible men. They mistook hunger for housebroken. After months of paralysis, Hindenburg agreed. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler became chancellor at the head of a coalition with only a few cabinet posts for Nazis. Papen boasted, "We've hired him." Crowds cheered by torchlight. Many elites relaxed, believing normalcy would assert itself. But legality was the Trojan horse Hitler had always promised to ride. Within days, he sought control of the police, pressured radio stations, and prepared for new elections under conditions shaped by intimidation. The key to dictatorship was not seizing every lever at once, but securing the few that move all the others: security, propaganda, emergency powers. He now stood within the machinery of the state, ready to accelerate it toward a destination most still refused to imagine. On February 27th, the Reichstag burned. Who struck the match remains debated. What followed does not. Hitler framed the fire as proof of a communist plot and demanded extraordinary authority to protect the nation. That night, civil liberties were suspended by decree. Freedom of speech, assembly, and privacy vanished at a stroke. Police raided opposition offices, newspapers were silenced, thousands were arrested. Weeks later, the Enabling Act arrived, presented as a temporary necessity, drafted as a permanent transfer of legislative power from parliament to cabinet. Surrounded by SA guards, intimidated deputies voted. Only the Social Democrats stood and said no. With that vote, the Constitution remained on paper, but ceased to function. Dictatorships rarely announced themselves as permanent. They arrived disguised as emergency management. The new regime did not have to ban parties to break them. It simply made politics impossible. Courts looked away, business adapted, and many citizens welcomed the return of order after years of turmoil. The price of calm was consent to authority without limit. The Republic did not collapse. It complied. With legal power secured, the regime fused state and party in a process called Gleichschaltung, coordination. Unions were absorbed, regional governments replaced, cultural life brought to heel. The radio became a national megaphone. Schools recited ideology. Professional associations purged the unreliable. Terror enforced the edges. Early concentration camps held political opponents. Informers multiplied. Fear did administrative work far more efficiently than law. Yet one threat remained inside the movement itself. The SA, swollen and unruly, frightened the army and unsettled industrialists. Its leader Ernst Röhm spoke of a second revolution. Hitler chose the army. In late June 1934, he ordered a purge. Over several days, the regime killed Röhm and many others, rivals, critics, and inconvenient allies. The message was precise. Loyalty flowed in one direction. Power would not be shared. The army swore personal allegiance to Hitler. Conservatives breathed easier, believing radicalism had been tamed. In fact, the machinery of murder had been normalized as governance. The dictatorship no longer needed improvisation. It had procedures. What violence began, myth completed. Propaganda elevated Hitler beyond politics. He was presented as worker and soldier, thinker and builder, destiny made flesh. Rallies turned crowds into a single body, choreographed to respond as one. Films by Leni Riefenstahl, transformed parades into sacred spectacle. Cheap radios carried speeches into kitchens and bedrooms. Children entered youth organizations where obedience was not a rule, but a virtue. The regime preached unity while crushing individuality. It sold prosperity while directing the economy toward rearmament. It redefined patriotism as unconditional submission. Many citizens reconciled themselves to the new order because daily life, jobs, holidays, highways, seemed to improve. But the improvements were conditional and instrumental, designed to ready a nation for conflict. Persecution intensified in policy and practice. Jews were excluded from professions, public life, and rights with the Nuremberg laws. Violence was organized, then denied. Abroad, reoccupying the Rhineland and annexing Austria fed the narrative of national resurrection. At home, doubt subsided, either by conviction or by caution. The leader's image filled the horizon so completely that alternatives seemed not merely dangerous, but unimaginable. By the late 1930s, Germany had been transformed into a mobilized society where economy, education, law, and culture served a single will. Rearmament delivered jobs and pride. It also demanded resources, targets, and constant escalation. The regime tested the world and found it hesitant. The Rhineland brought no punishment. Austria's Anschluss drew cheers. Munich rewarded threats with territory. Each success confirmed a deadly lesson, that opponents feared war more than the regime did. Inside Germany, dissent had nowhere to lodge. Churches were pressured, parties erased, and private speech carried public risk. The secret police did not need to be everywhere. They needed only to be believed to be everywhere. By 1939, the state's momentum pointed outward. The pact with the Soviet Union neutralized the nightmare of a two-front war and cleared the path to invade Poland. In August, trains moved, timetables hardened, and propaganda rehearsed its lines. The republic that had once stumbled through coalitions and compromises was now a war machine. It had not been destroyed in a moment. It had been refashioned, step by step, by a leader who understood that democracies do not always die in violence. They die when enough people decide that fear is safer than freedom.